The wedding dress felt like a prison of silk and lace, squeezing Tabitha Patterson's substantial frame as she stood at the altar of Brownsville's only church, watching her intended groom sprint down the aisle toward the exit like the devil himself was on his heels. The stunned silence that followed Gerald Morrison's departure lasted only seconds before the whispers erupted like wildfire through the packed pews, and Tabitha felt every eye in Cameron County, Texas, boring into her back as the July heat of 1882 made sweat bead on her forehead beneath the veil she had so carefully arranged that morning. She could not move, could not breathe, could not do anything but stand there in her white dress that had taken 3 seamstresses 2 months to construct, her bouquet of wildflowers trembling in her plump hands as the reality of what had just happened crashed over her like a wave. Gerald was gone. He had taken one look at her standing there waiting for him, turned pale as a ghost, and run. Just ran, without a word, without an explanation, leaving her standing alone before God and the entire town. Reverend Matthews cleared his throat awkwardly, his weathered face creasing with sympathy and discomfort in equal measure. The church, which moments ago had been filled with anticipation and barely concealed curiosity, now buzzed with scandalized murmurs and poorly hidden snickers. Tabitha heard fragments of conversation floating toward her. Always knew he would come to his senses. Poor thing, but really, what did she expect? A woman of her size, thinking a man like Gerald Morrison would actually go through with it. The words cut deeper than any knife ever could, and Tabitha felt her eyes burning with tears she refused to shed in front of these people. She had known, somewhere deep in her heart, that this might happen. Gerald had been distant these past few weeks, his visits becoming shorter, his affection cooling like coffee left too long on the table. But she had convinced herself it was wedding jitters, that every couple went through doubts before taking such a momentous step. She had been wrong. "Perhaps we should," Reverend Matthews began gently, reaching out as if to touch her shoulder, but Tabitha stepped back, still unable to speak, unable to process the magnitude of her humiliation. Her mother was weeping loudly in the front pew. Her father's face was red with barely contained rage, and her younger sisters looked torn between sympathy and relief that they were not the ones standing where she stood. Then, cutting through the whispers and the pity and the cruel laughter that was beginning to bubble up from the back rows, a voice rang out clear and strong. "I will marry you today." Every head in the church swiveled toward the source of the declaration. Tabitha lifted her eyes from the floor where they had been fixed, searching through her veil for whoever had spoken such impossible words. There, standing up in one of the middle pews, was a man she had never seen before. He was tall and lean, built like someone who spent his life in the saddle, with sun-darkened skin and hair the color of wheat that needed cutting. He wore simple clothes, dusty from travel, a brown vest over a cream-colored shirt, dark trousers and boots that had clearly walked many miles. A cowboy, by the looks of him, probably passing through town and curious enough about a wedding to step inside the church for a few minutes' respite from the heat. "What did you say?" Reverend Matthews asked, his bushy eyebrows rising toward his hairline. The stranger stepped into the aisle, his movements confident despite every eye now being fixed on him with expressions ranging from shock to outrage to confusion. He walked closer to the altar, and Tabitha could see his face more clearly now. He was perhaps 30 years old, with a strong jaw and eyes that were an unusual shade of gray-green, like the Rio Grande in certain lights. There was a scar cutting through his left eyebrow, giving him a slightly dangerous appearance, but his expression was earnest as he looked directly at her. "I said I will marry you today, miss," he repeated, his voice carrying a slight accent she could not quite place, something Midwestern perhaps. "If you will have me, that is." "This is insane," someone called from the crowd. "You do not even know her." Neither did half the folks who got married on the wagon trains west, the stranger replied without taking his eyes off Tabitha. Knowing someone and building a life with them are not always the same thing. And it seems to me that this lady has been treated mighty poorly, standing up here prepared to make vows to a man who did not have the courage to keep his word. She deserves better than that. Tabitha found her voice at last, though it came out smaller than she intended. "Why would you do this? You do not know me. You do not know anything about me." The stranger took another step closer, now standing at the base of the altar steps, looking up at her. "You are right. I do not know you, but I know something about being judged for things that should not matter. I know something about people thinking they know your worth based on what they see on the outside. And I know that any woman who would stand up here with her head held high despite everything that just happened is someone with more courage than most folks I have met." "You are out of your mind." Tabitha's father, Thomas Patterson, stood from his pew, his face still red. "This is my daughter you are talking about, stranger. You cannot just waltz in here and propose marriage like you are ordering a drink at a saloon." "With respect, sir, your daughter was about to marry a man just minutes ago. The church is prepared, the reverend is here, the guests are assembled. The only thing that is changed is the groom, and I would wager I am a better man than one who would run out on his promises." The stranger turned back to Tabitha. "My name is Henry Vaughn. I have been working cattle drives from Texas to Kansas for the past 8 years. I have some money saved, enough to start a small ranch of my own. I am honest. I do not drink to excess. I have never raised a hand to a woman or child, and I keep my word once I give it. That is all I can offer you in terms of credentials." The church had gone silent again, everyone waiting to see what would happen next. Tabitha felt as though she were in a dream or perhaps a nightmare from which she could not wake. This could not be happening. Men did not simply offer to marry women they had never met, not in real life, not outside of those dime novels her sister Margaret liked to read. Why? She asked again because she needed to understand. "Why would you tie yourself to me? Look at me." She gestured to herself, to her large body that had been the source of whispers and judgment her entire life. "You could have anyone. You could have a normal woman." Something flickered across Henry Vaughn's face then, something that looked like pain, and when he spoke again his voice was softer. "You are a normal woman, and I am making this offer because I think we could help each other. You need a husband, clearly. And I need a wife if I am going to settle down and build that ranch I have been dreaming of. We could make a partnership of it, see where it leads." "A partnership," Tabitha repeated slowly. "To start with, yes. No pressure, no expectations beyond basic respect and honesty. We get married today, as you planned, and we see if we cannot build something good together." Henry climbed the first step of the altar, close enough now that she could see the sincerity in his unusual eyes. "Or you can walk out of here unmarried and let every person in this church go home and gossip about you for the next 10 years. Your choice, Miss Patterson." It was the matter-of-fact way he said it that decided her. Not pity, not condescension, just a simple statement of reality. She could refuse him, gather what remained of her dignity, and go home to face her family and this town as a jilted woman, an object of ridicule and sympathy in equal measure. Or she could take this impossibly strange offer from a stranger and at least salvage something from this disaster. "You will regret this," she said quietly, so only he could hear. "Maybe," Henry Vaughn replied, "but maybe not. What do you say?" Tabitha took a deep breath, feeling the corset stays dig into her ribs, and made a decision that would change her life forever. "Reverend Matthews, if you are willing, I would like to marry this man." The chaos that erupted in the church was immediate and deafening. Her mother fainted, her father started shouting, her sisters gasped, and half the congregation began talking at once. But Reverend Matthews, to his credit, simply looked between Tabitha and Henry Vaughn for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "If this is truly what you want, Tabitha, then I will perform the ceremony," he said. "But I must ask, young man, are you certain? This is not a decision to be made lightly." "I am certain, Reverend," Henry said firmly. He climbed the remaining steps and took his place beside Tabitha, and she caught the scent of leather and sage and summer dust. "Let us begin." What followed was perhaps the strangest wedding ceremony ever performed in Brownsville, Texas. Half the guests stormed out in protest, including Gerald Morrison's entire family, who looked as scandalized as if someone had suggested dancing naked in the streets. Tabitha's father continued to object loudly until her mother, revived with smelling salts, grabbed his arm and hissed something in his ear that made him sit down heavily, his face still red but his mouth closed. Henry Vaughn spoke his vows in that same steady voice, promising to love, honor, and cherish her until death parted them. And when it was Tabitha's turn, she found her voice had returned, stronger now, and she meant every word even though she was marrying a complete stranger. Because whatever else Henry Vaughn might be, he had done something no one else in her life had ever done. He had chosen her, voluntarily, publicly, when he could have simply stayed silent and gone about his day. When Reverend Matthews pronounced them man and wife, Henry lifted her veil with gentle hands, and with a small smile that somehow eased the knot of anxiety in her chest, kissed her briefly on the lips. It was chaste and quick, appropriate for a church, but Tabitha felt the softness of his mouth and the scratch of his stubble, and it made everything feel terrifyingly real. They walked back down the aisle together, past the remaining guests who stared with open mouths and wide eyes, past her weeping mother and stone-faced father, past Margaret, who looked torn between horror and fascination. Out into the blazing July sunshine where the heat hit like a physical wall, and suddenly Tabitha realized she had no idea what happened next. "I have a room at the boarding house on Main Street," Henry said, as if reading her thoughts. "We can go there, get you out of that dress that looks like it is causing you discomfort, and talk about what comes next." "I have things at my father's house," Tabitha said, still feeling dazed. "My clothes, my possessions. We can collect them," Henry assured her. "But perhaps not right this moment. Let your family have some time to adjust to what just happened." That was putting it mildly, Tabitha thought. Her family was likely in complete upheaval. Her father had spent months arranging her marriage to Gerald Morrison, a merchant's son with good prospects, seeing it as an excellent match for his eldest daughter, despite Gerald's obvious reluctance. The courtship had been brief and businesslike, more negotiation than romance, but Tabitha had allowed herself to hope that affection might grow with time. Now that hope lay shattered, replaced with something so strange and unexpected that she could not fully process it. They walked down the dusty main street of Brownsville, an odd pair drawing stares from everyone they passed. Tabitha still wore her wedding dress, now wilting in the heat, and Henry walked beside her with his hat in his hands, his stride measured to match her slower pace. She was not accustomed to walking long distances, and the dress was heavy, and by the time they reached the boarding house run by Mrs. Callahan, Tabitha was breathing hard and sweating profusely. Come in," Mrs. Callahan said when she saw them, her round face creasing with concern. "Goodness gracious, you look about to faint. What in heaven's name?" Her eyes took in the wedding dress, then Henry, and her expression transformed into one of shock. "Henry Vaughn, what have you done?" "Got married, Mrs. Callahan," Henry said calmly. "This is my wife, Tabitha. Tabitha, this is Mrs. Callahan, who runs the best boarding house in Cameron County." "Your wife?" Mrs. Callahan's voice climbed an octave. "But you only arrived yesterday. How could you possibly be married?" "It is a long story," Tabitha managed. "Might I have some water, and perhaps somewhere to sit down, Mrs. Callahan's maternal instincts overrode her curiosity, and she quickly ushered them into the cool interior of the boarding house, settling Tabitha into a chair in the small sitting room while she fetched water and enlisted Henry's help in loosening the laces of the wedding dress enough that Tabitha could breathe properly. The relief was immediate and immense, and Tabitha drank the water gratefully, while Mrs. Callahan fussed and Henry stood by looking somewhat helpless in the way men often did when confronted with women's clothing complications. Once Tabitha had recovered somewhat, Mrs. Callahan's curiosity could no longer be contained, and the whole story came tumbling out, with Henry providing the details that Tabitha, still overwhelmed, could not quite articulate. Mrs. Callahan listened with a range of expressions crossing her face, from shock to outrage on Tabitha's behalf to something like approval when Henry explained his reasoning. "Well," she said when the tale was complete, "I have heard of many strange things in my 50 years, but this takes the prize. However, what is done, and you will need a proper room, not that tiny single Henry has been using. I have a larger room on the second floor with a real bed and space for a woman's things. It will cost more, of course." "That is fine," Henry said, pulling out a leather pouch that clinked with coins. "Whatever is appropriate." They made arrangements while Tabitha sat in her loosened dress, still feeling as though she were watching all of this happen to someone else. She was married to a stranger named Henry Vaughn, who had appeared out of nowhere and offered to save her from humiliation. It was insane. It was impossible. It was her new reality. By the time evening fell, Tabitha's trunk had been retrieved from her father's house by Henry, who reported that the conversation had been tense but civil, with Thomas Patterson making clear that while he disapproved of the entire situation, he would respect his daughter's choice. Tabitha suspected her mother had played a role in that decision, but she was grateful regardless. The trunk contained her clothes, a few books, her mother's old quilt, and the small wooden box that held the few pieces of jewelry she owned. The room Mrs. Callahan had given them was indeed larger than what Henry had been using, with a real bed covered in a faded quilt, a wardrobe, a washstand, and a window that looked out over the street. It was simple but clean, and as Tabitha changed out of her wedding dress and into a simple cotton house dress that did not require a corset, she felt some of the tension begin to leave her body. Henry had stepped out to give her privacy, and when he knocked softly on the door to ask if he could come back in, Tabitha felt a flutter of nervousness that was entirely new. This was her wedding night, such as it was, though nothing about this situation was typical or expected. He entered quietly, having removed his vest and boots, looking less like the confident stranger who had stood up in church, and more like a man who was also uncertain about what happened next. They stood there for a moment, not quite looking at each other, the weight of what they had done settling over them like dust after a storm. "I will sleep on the floor," Henry said finally. "I have blankets and a bedroll. You take the bed. I do not expect anything from you beyond what I said in the church. This is a partnership, and we will figure out what that means as we go." Tabitha felt something in her chest loosen slightly at those words. "Thank you," she said softly. "I appreciate that. This has all been so much, so fast." "I imagine so," Henry said, beginning to arrange his bedroll near the window. "For what it is worth, I do not regret what I did today, but I understand that you barely know me and trust is something that has to be earned, not demanded." They settled into their separate sleeping arrangements as darkness fell completely over Brownsville. Tabitha lay in the bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to Henry's steady breathing from the floor, and tried to make sense of her life. This morning she had woken as Tabitha Patterson, spinster daughter who had somehow managed to secure a husband despite her size. Now she was Tabitha Vaughn, married to a cowboy who had appeared like something from one of Margaret's novels. Sleep was long in coming, but eventually exhaustion from the emotional turmoil of the day overtook her, and she drifted off to the sound of dogs barking in the distance, and the occasional rumble of a wagon passing on the street below. Morning came with bright sunlight streaming through the window and the smell of coffee drifting up from the kitchen below. Tabitha woke slowly, disoriented at first, then remembered everything with a rush that made her stomach clench. She sat up carefully, expecting to see Henry's bedroll, but found it already neatly put away. Henry himself sat in the single chair by the window, already dressed, looking out at the street with a cup of coffee in his hands. "Good morning," he said when he noticed she was awake. "I brought you coffee. Figured you might need it." Tabitha accepted the cup gratefully, noting that he had somehow remembered or guessed that she preferred it with sugar but no cream, or perhaps he had simply made an educated guess. They drank in silence for a few minutes, a silence that felt less awkward than the previous nights, as if some invisible barrier had been crossed simply by surviving their first night as husband and wife. "We should talk about plans," Henry said eventually. "About what we are going to do, where we are going to go." "Go," Tabitha repeated. "Are we not staying in Brownsville? Do you want to stay here?" Henry asked gently. "With everyone knowing what happened yesterday, with your family and that Gerald Morrison fellow and all the folks who laughed." Tabitha considered this. The thought of walking through town, facing the stares and whispers, made her stomach turn. But it was also the only home she had ever known, and the thought of leaving, of going somewhere completely unknown, was terrifying in a different way. "Where would we go?" she asked. Henry leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, looking at her directly. "I have been saving for years to buy land and start a ranch. There is property available further north, near San Antonio in Bexar County. Good grazing land, access to water, room to build. I have enough money now to make a solid start. We could go there, build something of our own, away from everyone who knows what happened here." "A ranch," Tabitha said slowly. "I do not know anything about ranching." "You can learn," Henry said. "And in the meantime, there is plenty to do beyond just working cattle. A ranch needs someone to manage the house, the garden, the chickens, the accounts. Someone to cook and mend and help with 100 different things. It would not be easy, but it would be ours." There was something in the way he said ours that made Tabitha's heart beat a little faster. A place that was theirs, where no one knew her history or felt entitled to judge her body or her worth. Where she could be just Tabitha Vaughn, wife of a rancher, building a new life. "When would we leave?" she asked, and saw something like relief flash across Henry's face. "As soon as we can make arrangements. A few days, perhaps a week. Time enough to say proper goodbyes to your family, to buy supplies, to arrange transportation." He paused. "Are you sure? I know this is asking a lot." Tabitha thought about Brownsville, about the church where she had been humiliated, about walking past the Morrison family store and seeing Gerald's mother's hateful stare, about the whispers that would follow her everywhere. Then she thought about somewhere new, somewhere she could start fresh with a man who had, for reasons she still did not fully understand, chosen her when no one else would. "I am sure," she said. "Let us go build a ranch." The next few days passed in a flurry of activity. Henry sold his horse to a local rancher and used the money to buy a sturdy wagon and a team to pull it. He purchased supplies with the careful consideration of someone who knew exactly what would be needed: tools, seeds, flour, salt, coffee, blankets, rope, nails, and 100 other things. Tabitha watched him work with growing respect, seeing the competence and experience in every decision he made. She visited her family one last time, a difficult meeting where her mother wept and begged her to reconsider. Her father remained stubbornly silent, and her sisters regarded her with a mixture of envy and concern. Only Margaret, the romantic, seemed to understand. "You are going on an adventure," Margaret whispered as they hugged goodbye. "It is like something from a story. I hope you will write to me and tell me everything." "I will," Tabitha promised, though she wondered what she would possibly have to write about. Her life had been so ordinary until 3 days ago. On the morning they were set to leave, the wagon packed and ready, Tabitha wore a simple traveling dress and a bonnet to shield her face from the sun. Henry helped her up onto the wagon seat with careful hands, making sure she was settled comfortably before taking his place beside her. Mrs. Callahan came out to wish them well, pressing a basket of food into Tabitha's hands for the journey. "You take care of each other," she said, looking between them with something like motherly concern. "Marriage is not easy, even under normal circumstances, but if you can be kind to each other and honest with each other, you will have a chance." "Thank you, Mrs. Callahan," Henry said sincerely, "for everything." Then he clicked his tongue at the horses, and the wagon lurched into motion, carrying them north out of Brownsville and away from everything Tabitha had ever known. The journey to San Antonio took nearly 2 weeks, following rough roads that sometimes deteriorated into little more than trails. They traveled slowly, partly because of the heavy wagon and partly because Henry seemed to sense that Tabitha needed time to adjust to this new reality. They fell into a rhythm quickly, rising at dawn, traveling until the heat became oppressive, resting during the worst of the afternoon sun, then continuing until dusk. At night, Henry taught Tabitha how to build a proper campfire and cook over it, how to secure the horses, how to read the sky for signs of coming weather. She expected him to be impatient with her ignorance, but he never was. He explained things clearly, and did not make her feel foolish for not knowing what he considered basic skills. In return, Tabitha shared what she knew: how to calculate expenses and manage accounts, her knowledge of medicinal herbs learned from her mother, how to mend clothes so the stitches were nearly invisible. They talked as they traveled, sharing pieces of their histories in small increments. Henry told her about growing up in Missouri, about losing his parents to fever when he was 15, about working his way south through various ranches and cattle drives, learning the trade and saving every penny he could. Tabitha told him about Brownsville, about being the eldest of 5 daughters, about always being the largest girl in any gathering, and the comments and cruelty that had accompanied that reality her entire life. "It never stopped hurting," she admitted one evening as they sat by the fire, the vast Texas sky spread above them glittering with more stars than seemed possible. "People thinking they had the right to comment on my body, to tell me I needed to eat less or move more or that I would never find a husband. And then when Gerald asked to court me, I thought maybe I had been wrong, maybe someone could see past all that, but I was not wrong. He just needed time to work up the courage to run." Henry was quiet for a long moment, poking at the fire with a stick. "When I was 17, working on a ranch in Oklahoma, there was a girl, Emma. She was the rancher's daughter, pretty as a picture, and somehow she took a liking to me. We talked about getting married, about building a life together. Then one day she overheard some of the other ranch hands talking about how I was half Cherokee on my mother's side. My mother never talked much about it, and I look white enough that most people do not question it. But it is true nonetheless. Emma did not want anything to do with me after that, said her father would never approve of her marrying someone with Indian blood. Tabitha looked at him with new understanding. That is why you did what you did in the church, because you know what it is like to be judged for things that should not matter. Partly, Henry agreed. Also because I meant what I said. Any woman who could stand there with dignity after being treated like that is someone worth knowing, worth building a life with if she is willing. Something shifted between them in that moment, some invisible wall coming down. Tabitha had been viewing this as a business arrangement, a practical solution to a practical problem. But sitting there under the stars, listening to Henry share his own pain and rejection, she began to see him as something more than just a convenient rescue. He was a person, complex and thoughtful, who had made an enormous sacrifice for a complete stranger. "Why did you come to Brownsville?" she asked. "Where were you going before you stopped at that church?" "I was looking at land in the area," Henry said, "trying to decide where to settle. I had been to San Antonio before and liked it, but wanted to see what else was available. I passed through Brownsville and saw the crowd heading into the church and was curious. Figured I would sit in the back and watch, maybe say a prayer for my parents." He shook his head. "I never expected to walk out of there married." "Do you really not regret it?" Tabitha asked quietly. "You could have any woman you wanted, Henry. You are handsome and capable and kind. You did not need to tie yourself to me." Henry turned to look at her fully, his gray-green eyes reflecting the firelight. "I chose you, Tabitha. Not because I felt sorry for you or because I did not have other options, but because in that moment I saw someone who deserved better than what she was getting, and I had the power to offer it. And these past days, getting to know you, I have not regretted it once. You are smart and funny and stronger than you give yourself credit for. I count myself lucky." Tabitha felt tears prick at her eyes, unexpected and hot. No one had ever said such things to her, not in her entire life. She had been tolerated, pitied, occasionally loved in the dutiful way family loved each other, but never valued like this. Never chosen like this. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. They sat together in comfortable silence after that, and when it came time to sleep, Tabitha found herself wishing that Henry would not spread his bedroll so far from hers beneath the wagon. But she said nothing, and he maintained the respectful distance he had promised, and she told herself that the warmth she felt had nothing to do with disappointment. They reached San Antonio on a blazing hot afternoon in late July. The city was larger and more bustling than Brownsville, with a mix of Spanish colonial architecture and newer American buildings, crowded streets, and the sound of multiple languages being spoken. Henry navigated through the chaos with calm confidence, taking them to a land office where he had apparently been corresponding with an agent about available properties. The agent, a florid-faced man named Mr. Dalton, greeted Henry with enthusiasm and eyed Tabitha with barely concealed surprise that she chose to ignore. Henry had written that he was married, apparently, though he had obviously written those letters before they had actually married. Another small kindness, claiming her as his wife before she truly was, making their unconventional arrangement seem more legitimate. Mr. Dalton spread maps across his desk, pointing out several properties. "This one here is 200 acres, good water access from a creek that runs year-round, already has a small cabin that needs work but is structurally sound. Previous owner died without heirs, so the price is fair. This one is larger but further from town, might be harder to get supplies in winter." Henry studied the maps carefully, asking detailed questions about water rights, neighboring properties, the quality of the grazing land. Tabitha tried to follow along but found herself overwhelmed by the technical details. What did she know about acres and water rights and grazing capacity? But when Mr. Dalton mentioned the cabin, she leaned forward with interest. "How small is the cabin?" she asked. "How many rooms?" Mr. Dalton looked surprised to be addressed by her directly. "Just one main room currently with a loft, but there is space to add on and the foundation is solid." One room. Tabitha felt her cheeks heat at the implication but pushed the thought aside. They could add rooms, make it larger, more suitable, if they stayed, if this worked. If Henry truly wanted to build a life with her and not just fulfill an impulsive promise made in a moment of chivalry. They rode out to see the property the next day, leaving the wagon at a livery and taking horses instead for the easier travel. Tabitha had not ridden in years and was nervous about whether any horse could comfortably carry her. But Henry found a large, patient mare who seemed unbothered by her weight. And after the first awkward minutes, Tabitha found the rhythm again and was able to enjoy the ride. The land, when they reached it, was beautiful in a spare, rugged way. Rolling hills covered in tough grass, dotted with oak and mesquite trees. The creek Mr. Dalton had mentioned cutting through the property with a cheerful gurgle. The cabin sat on a slight rise, small and weathered but still standing, with a porch that sagged on one side and windows that would need new glass. It was rough and isolated and would require an enormous amount of work. Tabitha loved it instantly. "We could build a garden here," she said, pointing to a flat area near the creek. "The water access would make it easier, and there is room to expand the cabin, maybe add another room or two. We would need a barn for animals and a chicken coop and a smokehouse for preserving meat." Henry watched her with a small smile as she walked around, pointing out possibilities, her earlier hesitation forgotten in the excitement of imagining what this place could become. "So you like it?" he asked. "I love it," Tabitha said honestly. "It is perfect." "It is a lot of work," Henry warned. "Years of work to build it into a real ranch." "I am not afraid of work," Tabitha said, and realized as she said it that it was true. For the first time in her life, she had a purpose beyond trying to make herself smaller, less noticeable, more acceptable to people who would never truly accept her. This place needed her, needed both of them, and that was a powerful feeling. Henry bought the property that afternoon, signing papers and transferring money while Tabitha waited outside the land office, watching the busy street and thinking about all the things they would need to buy, all the plans they would need to make. They spent another 3 days in San Antonio, purchasing supplies with even more care than before. Lumber for repairs, glass for windows, a plow, chickens in crates, seeds for planting, 2 cows, tools of every description. Henry also bought Tabitha a rifle and spent an afternoon teaching her how to load and fire it. "You will be alone sometimes when I am working the far sections of the property," he explained as she practiced shooting at a target he had set up. "You need to be able to protect yourself, whether from animals or people." Tabitha found she had a decent eye for shooting, and the weight of the rifle in her hands felt like safety, like capability. Another thing she had never imagined herself doing, but here she was, Henry's patient instruction helping her learn something completely new. They moved to the property on a warm morning in early August, the wagon even more heavily loaded than when they had left Brownsville, a small herd of livestock trailing behind. It took the better part of the day to reach the cabin, and when they arrived, tired and dusty, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that took Tabitha's breath away. "Welcome home, Mrs. Vaughn," Henry said softly, and Tabitha felt tears sting her eyes again at those simple words. Home. It was rough and remote and would test every bit of strength she had, but it was theirs, and that made all the difference. The first weeks on the ranch were a blur of back-breaking work from sunup to sundown. Henry worked on the cabin first, repairing the sagging porch, replacing broken boards, installing the new glass in the windows. Tabitha cleaned years of accumulated dirt and grime, scrubbing until her hands were raw, hanging curtains she had sewn during the journey, arranging their meager possessions to make the single room feel like a home. They worked in tandem, developing an unspoken understanding of who would do what, when to ask for help, and when to simply work side by side in comfortable silence. Henry built a chicken coop, and Tabitha established her flock, delighting in the fresh eggs each morning. He cleared and plowed a space for the garden while she planted seeds and carefully watered them from the creek, coaxing them to life in the Texas heat. They worked on the barn together, Henry doing the heavy construction while Tabitha helped where she could and prepared meals for them to eat in the shade during the worst heat of the day. It was exhausting, harder than anything Tabitha had ever done in her life, and she fell into bed each night so tired she could barely move. But it was also deeply satisfying in a way she had never experienced. Every improvement they made, every small success, felt like a victory. The garden began to sprout green shoots. The chickens laid eggs. The cows grazed contentedly. The cabin became tighter and more weatherproof with each repair, and slowly, carefully, Tabitha and Henry grew closer. It happened in small moments. Henry's hand steadying her when she stumbled on uneven ground, Tabitha mending a shirt for him with careful stitches. Shared laughter over some small mishap, the comfortable silence that fell between them as they worked. They still slept separately, Henry insisting on maintaining the respectful distance he had promised, but the distance felt less necessary with each passing day. One evening in September, as they sat on the newly repaired porch watching the sunset, Tabitha found the courage to ask something that had been on her mind. Henry, you ever wish you had married someone else? Someone who knew how to do all this already, who could be more help to you? Henry looked at her with surprise. No, why would I wish that? Because I am learning everything as I go. I make mistakes constantly. I am slow and clumsy, and I am sure you could have found someone better suited to this life. Henry set down the piece of leather he had been working on and turned to face her fully. Tabitha, you have worked harder in these past weeks than most people I know would have managed in months. You have not complained once, even though I know you are exhausted and your hands are blistered and this is all completely new to you. You learn fast, you think ahead, and you make this place feel like a home and not just a building. I could not ask for a better partner. Partner, Tabitha repeated softly. It was the word he had used in the church, and he had maintained that definition of their relationship scrupulously. But somewhere along the way, Tabitha had begun to want more than partnership. She wanted the closeness she saw in her parents during their better moments, the intimacy that marriage was supposed to bring. But she did not know how to say that, did not know if Henry felt the same way or if he was content with their current arrangement. Unless you want something different, Henry said carefully, as if reading her thoughts. I meant what I said about no pressure, no expectations, but if you wanted this to be more than just a business arrangement, I would not be opposed to that. Tabitha's heart began to beat faster. What kind of more? Henry reached out and took her hand, his palm calloused from work, his touch gentle. The kind where we are truly husband and wife in all ways, where we build not just a ranch but a family, a real life together. But only if that is what you want. I will not push you into anything. Tabitha looked down at their joined hands, his tanned and scarred from years of hard work, hers plump and reddened from scrubbing and gardening. They were so different, had come together under such strange circumstances, but somehow it worked. Somehow this impossible situation had become something real and precious. "I want that," she said quietly. "I have wanted that for a while now, but I did not know if you did. I thought maybe you still just saw this as a convenient arrangement." "No," Henry said firmly. "I stopped seeing it that way somewhere between Brownsville and San Antonio. You are not convenient, Tabitha Vaughn. You are extraordinary. And I would very much like to be your husband in truth, if you will have me." Tabitha felt tears spill down her cheeks, but for once they were tears of happiness rather than pain or humiliation. She turned her hand in his, gripping his fingers tightly. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will have you." Henry smiled, that rare, full smile that transformed his face, and leaned forward slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted. But she did not want to pull away. She wanted this, wanted him, wanted the life they were building together to be complete. When his lips met hers, it was soft and sweet, and so much better than the brief, chaste kiss they had shared at the altar. This kiss held promise and affection, and the beginning of something deeper. That night when they entered the cabin, Henry did not spread his bedroll on the floor. Instead, they came together in the narrow bed with a tenderness that made Tabitha's heart ache. Henry's patience and gentleness showing her that this, too, could be good and right, and nothing to fear. Afterward, lying in his arms in the darkness, listening to his heartbeat steady beneath her ear, Tabitha felt a contentment she had never imagined possible. "I love you," Henry whispered into her hair. "I should have said it before, but I love you, Tabitha." "I love you too," she whispered back, and felt his arms tighten around her. Autumn came to the ranch, bringing cooler temperatures and the back-breaking work of the harvest. The garden produced bountifully, squash and beans and corn and tomatoes that Tabitha preserved for the winter ahead. Henry worked on expanding the herd, buying a few more cows and a bull from a neighboring rancher, planning for the future when they would have calves to sell. They added a second room to the cabin, giving them a separate bedroom and more space, making the place feel more substantial. They made occasional trips into San Antonio for supplies and news, and on one such trip in November, Tabitha realized with a start that she had not had her monthly courses in some time. She said nothing at first, afraid to hope, but when another month passed and her body began to change in unmistakable ways, she knew. She told Henry on a cool December evening, nervous despite everything they had shared, uncertain how he would react. But his response was immediate and joyful, sweeping her up in an embrace that lifted her feet off the ground despite her size, laughing and kissing her and declaring it the best news he had ever received. "A baby," he kept saying, wonder in his voice. "We are going to have a baby." The winter months passed slowly, Tabitha's belly growing as the ranch settled into the quieter rhythms of the cold season. Henry would not let her do any heavy work, taking on extra tasks himself, and treating her with a solicitude that was both touching and occasionally frustrating. But Tabitha understood it came from love, from the same instinct that had made him stand up in that church and offer to marry her. They talked for hours during the long winter evenings about names and plans and the future. Henry wanted to teach his son or daughter everything he knew about ranching and horses and living off the land. Tabitha wanted to make sure any child of theirs knew they were loved unconditionally, that their worth was not determined by how they looked or what others thought of them. "This child will know they are wanted," Henry said firmly one night, his hand resting on Tabitha's swollen belly. "Will never doubt for one moment that they are loved and valued exactly as they are." Tabitha thought about that church in Brownsville, about standing in her wedding dress while people laughed, about the years of judgment and cruelty she had endured. Then she thought about this rough cabin that had become a home, about the man who slept beside her each night and worked alongside her each day, about the life growing inside her that was the product of the strangest love story she could have imagined. "Yes," she agreed softly. "They will know." Spring arrived with a riot of wildflowers covering the hills, and new calves stumbling on uncertain legs in the pasture. Tabitha's time drew near, and Henry made arrangements with a midwife in San Antonio, a practical woman named Mrs. Chen, who agreed to come stay at the ranch when the birth was imminent. The baby came on a warm April morning in 1883, after a labor that was long and difficult but ultimately successful. Tabitha held their son for the first time as dawn broke over the ranch, tears streaming down her face as she looked at the tiny, perfect human they had created. He had Henry's nose and her brown eyes and a shock of dark hair, and he was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. "What should we name him?" Henry asked, his voice choked with emotion as he knelt beside the bed, touching his son's tiny hand with one careful finger. "Thomas," Tabitha said. "After my father. Thomas Henry Vaughn." Henry nodded, blinking back tears. "Thomas, it is perfect." Life with a baby was chaotic and exhausting and wonderful. Tabitha had worried that she might not know how to be a mother, but instinct and love guided her through the sleepless nights and endless feedings. Henry proved to be a devoted father, singing to Thomas in a surprisingly good voice, carrying him in a sling while he did chores, his face softening every time he looked at his son. The ranch continued to grow and prosper. Henry hired a young ranch hand named Miguel to help with the increasing work, a quiet boy of 19 who proved to be trustworthy and hardworking. With the extra help, Henry was able to focus on expanding their operations, buying more cattle, building a larger barn, establishing the Vaughn Ranch as a legitimate operation in the area. Tabitha managed the house and the accounts, keeping careful track of their income and expenses, making sure they lived within their means while still investing in the ranch's future. She discovered she had a head for business, able to negotiate good prices when they sold cattle or bought supplies, earning Henry's admiration and respect. When Thomas was a year old, Tabitha received a letter from her sister Margaret, full of news from Brownsville. Their father had passed away peacefully, their mother had moved in with their sister Elizabeth, and Gerald Morrison had married and then divorced within 6 months, a scandal that had rocked the town. Margaret's letter was full of questions about Tabitha's life, clearly fascinated by her sister's adventure. Tabitha wrote back, describing the ranch and Henry and Thomas, trying to capture in words the fullness of the life she had built. It was not always easy, she wrote honestly. The work was hard, money was sometimes tight, and the isolation could be difficult. But she was happy, truly happy in a way she had never been in Brownsville. "You ever miss it?" Henry asked when she finished the letter. "The town, your family, having neighbors close by?" Tabitha thought about it seriously. "Sometimes I miss my sisters," she admitted, "and it would be nice to have another woman to talk to occasionally, but miss Brownsville itself. No, that place held nothing but bad memories for me. This is my home now." Henry kissed the top of her head. "We could build something here, you know, not just a ranch but a community. There is talk of more families settling in the area. In a few years, there might be enough people to build a school, maybe even a church. We could be part of that." The idea appealed to Tabitha. To create something new, a place where people would know her only as Tabitha Vaughn, capable rancher's wife and mother, not as the fat girl who got jilted at the altar. Where Thomas could grow up surrounded by community and opportunity. As the years passed, that vision slowly became reality. More families did settle in the area, drawn by the available land and the success of early ranchers like Henry. A small town began to form about 5 miles from their ranch, just a general store and a blacksmith at first, but growing steadily. Tabitha became friends with other ranch wives, women who valued her for her kindness and competence rather than judging her for her appearance. She had another baby in 1885, a daughter they named Margaret after Tabitha's sister. Margaret was followed by another son, James, in 1887. The cabin grew along with their family, rooms added one by one until it was a proper ranch house, solid and spacious. The ranch itself grew as well, their herd increasing, their land holdings expanding through careful purchases and good management. Henry never stopped being the man who had stood up in that church and offered to marry her. He was steady and patient and kind, even during the difficult times when money was tight or the weather was bad, or they disagreed about how to handle some aspect of ranch management. He made Tabitha feel valued every single day, not despite her size but simply as herself, the woman he had chosen and continued to choose with every action. Tabitha, for her part, had found a strength she never knew she possessed. The girl who had stood in that church feeling humiliated and worthless had become a woman who could shoot a rattlesnake threatening her chickens, who could negotiate prices with tough merchants, who could run a household and raise children and manage ranch accounts, and still find time to help her neighbors when they needed it. She was proud of who she had become, proud of the life she and Henry had built. On a warm summer evening in 1890, Tabitha and Henry sat on their porch watching their children play in the yard. Thomas was 7 now, tall for his age and already showing signs of inheriting his father's skill with horses. Margaret was 5, imaginative and talkative, constantly making up stories. James was 3, into everything, keeping Tabitha constantly vigilant. "You remember the day we met?" Tabitha asked, leaning against Henry's shoulder. "Every detail," Henry said. "You standing there in that white dress, looking like you wanted the ground to swallow you up but refusing to run. I knew in that moment you were someone special." "I thought you were insane," Tabitha admitted with a laugh. "A complete stranger offering to marry me. I could not understand why anyone would do that. And now I understand that sometimes the strangest beginnings lead to the best endings," Tabitha said softly. "I never imagined I could be this happy, Henry. Never imagined I could have a life like this." Henry wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. "Neither did I. I thought I would just be building a ranch, making a living. I did not expect to find a partner, a love, a whole life." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over their land, over the home they had built together. Tabitha thought about that girl in the church 8 years ago, certain her life was over, that she would never be anything but a source of shame and pity. If she could go back and tell that girl what was coming, she would say that sometimes the worst moments lead to the best things. That humiliation can become redemption. That love can come from the most unexpected places. The small community near their ranch continued to grow, and in 1891, enough families had settled in the area to justify building a proper church. Henry and Tabitha donated lumber and labor to the project, working alongside their neighbors to raise the small but sturdy building. When it was completed, the community held a celebration, and Reverend Wilson, who had agreed to serve as the traveling preacher for the area, gave a sermon about new beginnings and the importance of community. After the service, as people gathered outside to talk and share food, a new family approached Henry and Tabitha. They had just arrived in the area, the husband explained, looking to start fresh after some difficulties back east. The wife was quiet, standing slightly behind her husband, and Tabitha noticed the way she held herself, as if trying to take up less space, the shame in her posture that Tabitha recognized all too well. "We heard this was a good community," the husband said. "Folks who do not judge too harshly, who give people a chance to prove themselves." "That is what we try to be," Henry said warmly. "I am Henry Vaughn. This is my wife Tabitha. What brings you to our part of Texas?" The husband glanced at his wife, then back at them. "My wife and I, we had some trouble in our last town. People were not kind about certain things, and we thought a fresh start might be best for us and our children." Tabitha saw the woman's eyes fill with tears, and she understood without being told what kind of unkindness they had faced. She stepped forward, extending her hand to the woman. "You will find friends here," she said firmly. "We know something about starting over, about building new lives away from places that did not appreciate us. You are welcome here." The relief on both their faces was profound, and as they talked more, learning that their name was Miller and they had 3 children and experience farming, Tabitha felt something settle in her chest. This was what she and Henry had helped build. A place where people could start over, where judgment was suspended in favor of giving folks a chance to prove their character through their actions rather than their appearance or their past. It was what had been given to her that day in the church, and now she could pay it forward. The years continued to pass, marked by the rhythms of ranch life and the growth of their children. Thomas grew into a capable young man, taking on more and more responsibility on the ranch, and showing every sign of being an excellent rancher someday. Margaret inherited her mother's head for figures and her father's steady temperament, able to gentle a spooked horse or balance a complicated account with equal skill. James was the adventurous one, always getting into scrapes and coming home with torn clothes and exciting stories. In 1895, Tabitha found herself pregnant again, a surprise given that she was now in her early 30s and had assumed their family was complete. But this baby, another daughter they named Sarah, was welcomed with the same joy as her siblings had been. Henry doted on his youngest child, carrying her everywhere when he was not working, singing her the same songs he had sung to Thomas all those years ago. The ranch had become one of the most successful in the area, known for quality cattle and fair dealing. Henry had earned a reputation as a skilled rancher and an honest man, someone whose word was his bond. Tabitha was equally respected, known for her sharp business sense and her kindness to neighbors in need. They had built exactly what they set out to build: a life, a home, a legacy. On their 15th wedding anniversary, Henry surprised Tabitha with a gift. It was a painting, commissioned from a traveling artist who had passed through the area months earlier. The painting showed their ranch house, the barn, the pastures stretching out behind it, the whole property rendered in careful detail. But what made Tabitha's eyes fill with tears was the foreground. Henry and Tabitha standing together on the porch, surrounded by their 4 children, all of them smiling, all of them clearly a family. "So we never forget where we started and how far we have come," Henry said softly, watching her face. Tabitha could not speak around the lump in her throat, so she simply wrapped her arms around her husband and held him close, this man who had changed her life with a single impossible offer. The girl who had stood in that church in Brownsville, humiliated and heartbroken, seemed like someone from another lifetime. That girl had become this woman, strong, capable, loved, a mother and a wife and a ranch owner, someone who had built a good life through hard work and love and the gift of a second chance. "Thank you," she finally managed, "for everything. For standing up that day, for bringing me here, for building this life with me." "Thank you for saying yes," Henry replied, "for taking a chance on a stranger who probably seemed completely insane, for being my partner and my love and my home." They hung the painting in the main room of the ranch house, where everyone who visited would see it. Tabitha often found herself looking at it, remembering that hot July day in 1882 when her life had fallen apart and been rebuilt in the space of an hour. She thought about Gerald Morrison sometimes, wondered what had become of him, but mostly she just felt a distant gratitude that he had run. Because if he had not, she would never have heard those words that changed everything. "I will marry you today." The community around their ranch continued to thrive. The small town that had started as just a store and a blacksmith now had a school where Margaret worked as a teacher when she was not helping on the ranch, a proper church with a full-time minister, a doctor, several shops, and a regular stagecoach route. More families arrived each year, drawn by reports of available land and a welcoming community. Tabitha took pride in the role she and Henry had played in building that community. They had sponsored families who needed help getting started, had donated to the school and the church, had opened their home to travelers and newcomers who needed a place to stay while getting established. It was how they paid forward the chance they had been given, the grace of a new beginning. In 1900, as a new century dawned, Thomas married a young woman named Lucy, daughter of a neighboring rancher. The wedding was held in the community church, and as Tabitha sat in the front pew watching her eldest son exchange vows, she could not help but think about her own wedding day. Two weddings in her life, so vastly different. The first, which never happened, where she stood in humiliation waiting for a groom who ran. The second, unexpected and strange, where a stranger became her salvation. After the ceremony, as the community gathered for the celebration, Henry found Tabitha standing alone for a moment, watching the festivities. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, slipping his arm around her waist. "About weddings," Tabitha said. "About how Thomas and Lucy are starting their life together with love and support and community. About how different that is from how we started." "We did all right, though," Henry said with a smile. "Strange start and all." "We did better than all right," Tabitha corrected. "We did magnificently." As they stood together watching their son dance with his new wife, surrounded by the community they had helped build, and the family they had created, Tabitha felt a deep sense of peace. Her life had not gone the way she once imagined it would. It had been harder, stranger, more difficult than anything she could have predicted. But it had also been infinitely better, richer, more full of love and purpose than she had ever dreamed possible, all because a cowboy in the crowd had stood up and said 5 simple words: "I will marry you today." The years that followed were good ones. Thomas and Lucy built a small house on a section of the Vaughn ranch land that Henry and Tabitha gave them as a wedding present, establishing their own operation while still being part of the larger family ranch. Margaret married in 1903, choosing a quiet teacher from San Antonio named Peter, and they settled in the community to run the school together. James, true to his adventurous nature, left for a few years to see the wider world, working on cattle drives north and riding through Colorado and Wyoming before returning home in 1906, ready to settle down at last. Sarah, their youngest, grew into a thoughtful girl who loved reading and music. Tabitha arranged for her to have piano lessons from an accomplished woman who had moved to their community, and the sound of music filling the ranch house became one of Tabitha's favorite things. In 1908, Tabitha and Henry became grandparents for the first time when Thomas and Lucy welcomed a son. More grandchildren followed over the years. Margaret and Peter had twin daughters. Thomas and Lucy added 2 more sons and a daughter, and eventually James married and started his own family. The ranch house that had started as a one-room cabin was constantly full of noise and life and love, exactly as Tabitha had always hoped it would be. As Henry and Tabitha grew older, they gradually turned over more of the ranch operations to their children, though neither of them ever fully retired. Henry still rode the property most days, checking fences and cattle, and Tabitha still managed the accounts and gardens. But they also made time to simply be together, to sit on the porch in the evenings and watch the sun set over the land they had built their life on. One evening in the summer of 1910, as they sat in their customary spots, Tabitha doing needlework and Henry whittling, they heard the sound of a wagon approaching. Visitors were common, and they looked up with interest to see who might be coming. The wagon came into view, and Tabitha's hand stilled on her work as she recognized the woman driving it. It was Margaret, her sister, older now and weathered by time, but unmistakably the same girl who had hugged her goodbye in Brownsville 28 years ago. "Margaret," Tabitha called out, setting aside her needlework and rising from her chair. Margaret climbed down from the wagon, moving carefully as if her joints pained her, and then she was hurrying forward and the sisters were embracing, both crying, words tumbling over each other. "I had to see you," Margaret said when they finally pulled apart. "I have wanted to visit for years, but circumstances never allowed it until now. I am on my way to live with Elizabeth in California. Her husband died last year and she is alone and asked me to come. I thought I would stop here first, see you, see the life you built." They talked long into the night, catching up on decades of letters that could never fully capture everything. Margaret met all of Tabitha's children and grandchildren, toured the ranch, marveled at everything her sister had accomplished. And finally, late that night when it was just the two of them sitting in Tabitha's kitchen drinking coffee, Margaret asked the question that had clearly been on her mind. "Are you happy, Tabitha? Truly happy? I know you made the best of what happened that day in the church, but are you glad for how it all turned out?" Tabitha thought about how to answer that. She could have said that yes, she was happy, which was true but did not capture the full picture. Instead, she took her sister's hand and spoke from the heart. "That day in the church was the worst and best day of my life," she said. "The worst because of the humiliation, the pain of being rejected so publicly, but the best because it brought me Henry. If Gerald had not run, I would have married him and been miserable, living with a man who did not love me, who saw me as a burden he was tolerating. Instead, I got Henry, who chose me freely and has loved me completely every day since. I got this ranch, this life, these children and grandchildren. I got to become someone I never imagined I could be. So yes, Margaret, I am happy. I am more than happy. I am blessed beyond measure." Margaret squeezed her hand, tears in her eyes. "I always hoped that was true. Your letters made it sound wonderful, but I needed to see it for myself. And now I have, and I can see it is real. You are truly happy, and that makes everything worth it." Margaret stayed for a week, and it was a sweet time of reconnection and shared memories. When she finally left, promising to write often and perhaps visit again someday, Tabitha felt a sense of completion. The last thread connecting her to her old life in Brownsville had been tied off, and she could fully embrace who she had become. The years continued their steady march. Henry and Tabitha celebrated their 30th anniversary in 1912, surrounded by their children and grandchildren and half the community, a joyous occasion that lasted all day and into the night. They celebrated their 35th anniversary more quietly, just the two of them taking a trip to San Antonio and staying in a fine hotel, pretending to be young again even as their joints ached and their hair had gone gray. In 1918, as the world was consumed by war and influenza, their small community was largely spared the worst of both. A few young men went off to fight, including their grandson Michael, Thomas's eldest son, but he returned safely when the war ended. The flu touched their community but did not devastate it, and the Vaughn family remained healthy and intact. It was in 1920, as Henry turned 60, that his health began to decline. Nothing dramatic, just a gradual slowing, a tiredness that did not go away with rest. The doctor they consulted could find nothing specifically wrong, but suggested that Henry had simply worn himself out with decades of hard physical labor. He needed to rest more, take things easier. Henry tried, but it was not in his nature to be idle. He still rode the property, still worked alongside his sons and grandsons, still refused to fully accept that he was getting old. Tabitha worried but knew better than to push too hard. Henry was who he was, and she loved him for it even when it frustrated her. They had 40 years together, 40 years of building and loving and living. 40 years that had started with the most improbable of beginnings and become something solid and real and beautiful. On their 40th anniversary in 1922, they renewed their vows in the community church, the same building they had helped build 30 years earlier, surrounded by everyone who mattered to them. "I still think you are insane," Tabitha whispered to Henry as they stood at the altar. Both of them older and grayer, but still fundamentally the same people who had stood in a church in Brownsville 4 decades ago. "Insane about you," Henry whispered back, and kissed her as the community applauded. Henry passed away peacefully in his sleep in the spring of 1925, at the age of 63. He had been checking the cattle with Thomas that afternoon, had eaten a good dinner, had sat on the porch with Tabitha watching the sunset, and then had simply not woken the next morning. The doctor said his heart had given out, worn down by decades of hard work and hard living, but that he had likely felt no pain. Tabitha grieved deeply, but without bitterness. They had been given 43 years together, which was more than many couples got. They had built a life and a family and a legacy. Henry had kept every promise he made in that church, had been the partner and husband and love he had offered to be. She could not regret a moment of it, even though the loss left a hole in her heart that would never fully heal. She continued living on the ranch, which was now run primarily by Thomas and James and their children. But she remained active in managing the household and accounts until her own health began to fail. In 1930, at the age of 68, Tabitha died quietly with all her children around her, holding her hand and telling her they loved her. At her funeral, which drew people from all over the county, Thomas stood to speak about his mother. He told the story that had become part of family legend. How his father had stood up in a church in Brownsville and offered to marry a woman he did not know. How his mother had been brave enough to say yes. How together they had built something remarkable from the strangest of beginnings. "My parents taught me that love is not just a feeling," Thomas said, his voice steady despite the tears in his eyes. "It is a choice, made every day through actions and words and commitment. My father chose my mother that day in the church, but he kept choosing her every day after that. And she chose him right back. They built a life on that choice, and all of us here are the result of their love. We are their legacy, and we will carry it forward." The Vaughn Ranch continued to thrive for generations, passed down through the family, a testament to what Henry and Tabitha had built. The story of how it started became family legend, told and retold to each new generation. The obese woman jilted at the altar, the cowboy who stood up and offered to marry her, the life they built together against all odds. And in the community they had helped establish, the values they had lived by continued to shape how people treated each other. Give people a chance. Judge them by their character and actions rather than their appearance or past. Build each other up rather than tearing each other down. Love is a choice and a commitment, not just a feeling. It was not a perfect community, because no place populated by humans ever is. But it was a good one, made better by the example Henry and Tabitha Vaughn had set. And that, perhaps, was the greatest legacy of all. Not just the ranch or the family, but the ripple effect of kindness and acceptance spreading outward through time and space, touching lives that would never even know the names of the people who started it all. The painting Henry had commissioned for their 15th anniversary hung in the ranch house for decades, preserved carefully by each generation. Eventually, in the late 20th century, it was donated to a local historical museum where it still hangs today. Visitors to the museum can see it. A family on a ranch, clearly prosperous and happy, the landscape of Texas stretching out behind them. Most people walk past it without much thought. But occasionally, someone stops and reads the placard that tells the story. And when they do, they pause, considering the tale of the obese woman who was jilted at the altar and the cowboy who stood up and said, "I will marry you today." They think about the courage that took, on both sides. They think about how the worst moments can become the best beginnings. They think about love as a choice and a commitment. And perhaps, if the story has done its work, they walk away thinking a little differently about judgment and acceptance, and the value of giving people a chance. Because that is what stories do at their best. They change us, little by little, making us see the world and each other with more compassion and understanding. The story of Henry and Tabitha Vaughn does that work. It reminds us that love can come from the most unexpected places, that courage can be found in the strangest moments, that a life can be built on a foundation of mutual respect and commitment and daily choice. It reminds us that we should never judge people based on their appearance, that everyone deserves dignity and kindness, that sometimes the most improbable beginnings lead to the most beautiful endings. And so the story endures, passed down through generations, told and retold, changed slightly with each telling but maintaining its essential truth. That on a hot July day in 1882 in Brownsville, Texas, a woman named Tabitha Patterson stood humiliated at a church altar, and a man named Henry Vaughn stood up and changed both their lives forever with 5 simple words. "I will marry you today." It was the beginning of everything. It was the foundation of a family, a ranch, a community, a legacy. It was proof that sometimes the strangest love stories are the truest, that courage and kindness and choosing to see the best in others can create something lasting and beautiful. And it was, quite simply, the story of how 2 broken people found each other and built something whole, something good, something that would outlast them both and ripple forward through time, touching lives they would never know, making the world just a little bit better for having been in it. That was the gift they gave, Henry and Tabitha Vaughn, not just to each other, not just to their family, but to everyone who heard their story and let it change them. And in the end, what more could anyone ask for? To be loved, to build a good life, and to leave the world a little better than you found it. That was their legacy. That was their truth. That was their love story told complete.